G'day guys, Mac with the Outer Circle. This is a follow-on from the video, by now would have been yesterday, that everyone saw regarding the Space Marines and scale change. Now, today's episode is going to be a lot less my personal thoughts and a lot more just the sort of objective facts of the situation, because I feel that my own personal thoughts and my over-the-top hyperbolic style of doing things for videos is not conducive to the argument. So we're going to strip me aside from this one, and we're going to talk about the things that are pretty damn obvious. And there are both good and bad points to this. So one of the most common things that was leveled against me was saying that I was being hypocritical because I said that a scale change would have been better than Primaris, and that because I've been saying that, I should be supporting a scale change in the Horus Heresy. People don't understand the difference between the two game systems in that regard, and we'll go into that a bit today. But first, we'll start with this image. This is an image of the Alpha Legion Terminator Praetor on the right, next to the new Imperial Fist Praetor on the left. For those who don't know, the Alpha Legion had typically larger Marines than other Space Marine Legions, which is why they're slightly smaller than average Primarchs were able to blend in with their own infantry. The size gap was a lot narrower for that legion. Now, does it affect my enjoyment of the tabletop seeing an image like this? No, it does not. So let's get it out of the way straight off the bat. What are some of the benefits to the new scale change? Well, I think for many people, they prefer the look. They think the proportions are better, and they also think that it gives them a better canvas to work on and it's easier to paint. Now, whilst I have debunked the easier to paint part on specific points, that being things like heads, shoulder pads, a lot of the detail and things like the shins is almost identical size to what it was, if not, in the case of shoulder pads and helmets, is identical in size. Therefore, it's no easier to paint. But at least in some regard, the larger model might give the impression of being easier to paint. It might be some psychological factor that comes into play there. This is all true. On another point of note, people have often complained for years that Space Marines feel too small because things like the Imperial Guard are too similar in size, such as height, to them. Well, one could point out that over the years, the sort of scale of the Imperial Guard has actually significantly crept up and up and up. If you go back and get some of the White Metal Guard from the 90s and compare them to the Marines of the 90s, the Marines were a head or two taller. But nowadays, the more detail they add to the model ranges across the board, the more the scale has crept up and up and up over the years. And it's very true that in this day and age, the Space Marines and the Imperial Guard are basically the same height. So you could perhaps justify it as some sort of disambiguation, but at the end of the day, the Marines should be bigger than the Guard. And on top of that, Terminators should be a little bit taller than Space Marines. Now, I say a little bit taller. Terminator armor, of course, is bigger and bulkier, but it doesn't really add much height except for the little, we'll call it the backpack ceiling, the little bit of archway that goes up and over the helmet on the Marine. That's where the extra height is. Other than that, a Terminator and a Space Marine are essentially the same height because the Terminator's feet aren't made of phone books. They're not that ridiculously thick that it makes the entire Marine himself taller. There are other things to be said about scale changes in that you'll have variations in height from Marine to Marine within a range, as you would in real life. Perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable, great concept. Where it falls down though is that you don't have a variety of heights at play here. What you have is essentially two distinct scales. Now, this has been a problem, and it will continue to be a problem, but it's been exacerbated here by incredibly large new Terminators. Now, this is not the first time that a large-scale creep, especially Terminators, has occurred. As I mentioned in the previous video, if you go back to 2nd and 3rd edition 40k, Terminators were the height of Space Marines. They were on 25mm bases. It wasn't until the White Metal Grey Knights were released, heading into 4th edition, that the Space Marines had an updated plastic kit, and Chaos actually followed significant time after that with getting their update. They stuck with the White Metal Terminators on 25mm bases for a very long time. The Space Marines, on the other hand, had had plastic Terminators for about 6 or 7 years off the top of my head by the time they updated them to the larger scale of Terminator. So it was already quite a significant jump going from 25mm guy to the 40mm base guy. It was huge. Now we've ended up in a situation where we have Terminators have not only leapfrogged the Space Marine range, but they've also leapfrogged the Custode range, because if my maths is correct, based on the height of this miniature and the known height of that Alpha Legion guy, this guy will actually dwarf Custodes. So, yeah. So what do you do there? Do you now go back and resculpt the Custodes? Don't know. That's a question for other minds. But the inherent problem comes in with the fact that there is a huge, diverse range of miniatures that require resculpt. And this is where I'll move forward in the imagery you're seeing on the screen. This here is the Space Marines range. Now, this is the Ultramarines that I've chosen. And they have specialist unique unit like the Tyrannic veterans there. Okay, one of the coolest things in the fluff that I can think of. They were a 4th edition Codex entry. But anyway, many of the miniatures you're seeing here say Command Company, 4th edition, Scouts, 4th edition. A lot of their characters, like the multi-part Space Marine Commander on the far right, 4th edition. And many of these models, you would notice, are still in scale with one another today. Now, 4th edition Space Marines was, off the top of my head, 2003, at latest 2004. So, 17 years at the least ago. So the scale has been pretty damn consistent for at least 17 years, one can say. You know, the Space Marine Honor Guard, 4th edition as well. Tyrannic War Veterans, 4th edition. Tech Marine, 4th edition. Servitors with that Tech Marine, 4th edition. Space Marine Masters of the Chapter, 4th edition. So you can see a lot of this range here is 4th edition. The bikes were 3rd edition, but in 4th edition, the attack bike went from being white metal upgrades to plastic upgrades. The Land Speeder, of course, comes from that same... It actually comes from 3rd edition, but got redone in, I believe it was 5th edition. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that consistency of scale has been a thing over the years. And when I spoke about the Primaris Marines should have just been a rescale of the existing range, this is what I was referring to. If you look on screen right now, you can see there are a number of duplicate units in there. Not too many, but there are a couple. But this is essentially the entire Space Marine range. If you were to look at another Space Marine chapter, like, say, the Blood Angels, you might replace that Tyrannic War Veterans with, say, Death Company or Sanguinary Guard. If you looked at Space Wolves, you might replace, say, the Legion Terminators with the Space Wolf-specific Legion Terminators, or maybe Tactical Squad with Grey Slayers. Those are things you could do. But most of the chapters, such as Iron Hands, Salamanders, Raven Guard, White Scars, they have very, very, very little in the way of upgrades or unique units. So it means that essentially this basic model range you're looking at right now is sort of universal to the entire Space Marine range for 40k. So if you want to do an upscaling, if you redo just the units you see on screen right now, you have basically done the entire range, everything you can do. And there are more units on this screen than you would feasibly do in any upscaling of the range. You wouldn't go through and update all the Masters of the Chapter. You probably wouldn't go through and update the Lord Executioner, for instance. Thunderfire Cannon, why bother? So those are, I mean, if you're going to, you'd make it in plastic and nice instead of the horrible resin thing that it is, because I have a legit one, and that thing is a terrible model. But anyway, you could go through and update this range, and something like the Ultramarines Honor Guard on the top left were updated essentially with Manius Kelgar and his release with his little Honor Guard, Blade Guard dudes that came with him. So it can be done. So you think about this right now, that's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 18, 26, 32. 32 units, okay? 32 units if you took this at face value that you would have to update for scale. And that's if you did every single one of these things. And that's even like including double ups in there. Let's look at the Space Marine Legions now for just an idea of the problem. And this isn't everything. There are a couple of model kits on here, or missing from here, because they aren't currently on the Forge World web store. For example, the White Scars Ebon Kashyyyk. Now, as you can see from here, this is 12 units wide by 5 units deep. That's already some 30 odd models, or 30 odd kits right there. This is just the unique forces for the Space Marine Legions. This isn't special characters, this isn't vehicles like land speeders, like including the ice one, this isn't bikes, this isn't the core infantry of the game, such as breaches, tactical marines, tactical support marines, assault squads. This is just the Legion unique or specific units and characters that you're seeing. So think to someone like the Ultramarines that you just saw. They have Tyrannic War Veterans, and of course the Legion Honor Guard. So that's only 2 units for them that have to be sort of worried about, and that's that chapter. Not so with 30k. You have probably, off the top of my head, 70 different sets you have to update. And that's where the problem comes in. Because in 40k, I promote the change of scale as working, because it's actually very few kits you have to update. We'll use Chaos Space Marines as an example here. Chaos Space Marines, when they just had their update to their codex in 40k, you get the Chaos Space Marine box set, gets upgraded in size, the Havocs get upgraded in size, and the Terminators get upgraded in size. The Raptors, they were already in a different scale. They're in some sort of weird mishmash scale where they were 6th edition scaled, but because of their poses and the rocks and things like that in their bases, they work in the new scale perfectly fine. But that's 3 units right there. Bikes probably deserve a rescaling, but you can get away with it because the riders are at least sitting in the bikes, and so you don't get the height of the rider to scale against the models around them. But that's 3 units, and you've essentially redone Chaos Space Marines. Yeah, you've still got Legion-specific units, but since the Legion-specific forces getting their own codexes, specifically Thousand Suns, Death Guard, I'm sure eventually you'll get some sort of Emperor's Children and World Eaters forces. It's very few kits you have to update an entire range, and there's many kits there that are universal to the range. Not so with the Horus Heresy. With the Horus Heresy here, as you can see, there are dozens and dozens of kits, and this is just for the individual legions. And some of these, like the Dark Angels models, for instance, are very new models. Now, this is all great in theory right now. But what happens when we introduce a new scale into the game? Well, if the new scale includes things like new Terminators and new power armor, they are going to be significantly taller than the guys around them. Now, to some, it's a non-issue. So let's just get that out of the way. To others, it is an issue. And that's the side of the argument I'm talking about today. And the issue is that you're going to end up with these 2 weird sizes in the army. And again, knowing the mindset of most Heresy players, they like uniformity because they're trying to recreate a specific theme or force. And many people have already gone out of their way to true scale. And that's perfectly fine. I'm never going to deny someone a game because they did something like true scale, they use some new range of miniatures, or they have mixed heights in their force. That doesn't faze me. I will construct the army that suits my needs best, as anyone will. They will construct what suits their needs best. But the problem lies in that if new kits are introduced for the system, you'll end up with a range of plastic miniatures which are significantly different to the range of existing expensive resin miniatures. This is a problem of Forge World and Games Workshop's own creation. It is not a problem that needed solving, or if it was going to be done, it should have been done much earlier in the process. It's at the point where you've gone so far beyond the time that it should have been done, it should have been just left at this stage. If you're going to reinvigorate the Horus Heresy and create a new set of sculpts in a new scale, That's perfectly fine, but it needs to be done as sort of a homogeneous entity. You can't bring out all the Dark Angels units, for example, and then 1 year later introduce a new set of Terminators, as an example, that are taller than the Dark Angels Terminators. Same thing with something like the Alpha Legion or the Blood Angels or the White Scars. They have only had a year or two of having a lot of their range, and it's taken 10 years to get to this point where we have even this much stuff available to them. So having this much stuff available, but then having it essentially circumvented? I think I just made up a word. Circumvented or superseded by the new range. That's kind of not great. In fact, it's very not great. It's a bizarre situation we find ourselves in here, because I'm not against a scale change, and I'm not against the new miniatures. I think they look gorgeous. And I don't think people quite understand that take. They don't understand how a person can love something and yet have a problem with it. Well, the problem to me is inherently that you are going to have two different scales within the game. And whilst it doesn't matter to some, it matters to me. And I know it matters to a lot of other people. There wouldn't be anyone talking about the scale change if it didn't matter. I think that's the easiest way to summarize that fact. So, 40k, why did it work? It works because there's so few units you have to change an entire range. And we see it happen. We've seen it happen with the Necrons. We've seen it happen with the Dark Eldar. We've seen entire ranges get revamped at once. The Tyranids had a big range revamp in 4th edition. They, of course, haven't been touched since, which is, a joke in and of itself, but it can be done. With 30k, though, it didn't need to be done, and it's further exacerbated by the fact that in 40k, you're measuring Marines against all the other factions. In 30k, you're measuring Marines against each other. The only time that Marines are not being measured against Marines is when you're playing Mechanicum, who are mostly robotic forces and have very few human-sized models in their range. Therefore, the Marine size doesn't factor into things, because there's never situations where your Marine is standing eye to eyeball level with many models in the Mechanicum range. They're usually looking up at things like Castellax and Thalax and Thanatar and Domitar and Vorax and all these big monstrous creatures in the Mechanicum. So their scale worked fine. It's Solar Auxilia. Solar Auxilia was the range that sort of jumped the shark, being, in some cases, slightly taller than certain Space Marine kits. So the Solar Auxilia is an instance where it's like, okay, yeah, the Marines need to be bigger compared to that. But the problem isn't the Marines. The problem there was the Solar Auxilia. It was a range introduced well into the Heresy. 3 years the Horus Heresy had been around for by the time they were introduced. And at that point, it's like, well, how come they went for that larger scale? They decided on it. They manufactured the problem there of scale creep. It wasn't a thing within the Heresy to that point. And to this day, if you ignore something like the Solar Auxilia or certain militia forces, then the Space Marines work in scale with one another. They work in scale with the Mechanicum. They work in scale with Imperial Knights. They work in scale with Custodes. And then, of course, you get the Sisters of Silence, who, again, have been scaled upwards. Why are they doing this? It could be due to limitations of the technology that they have. You can sculpt a model at any scale that you like, but the amount of detail you can produce in said model is related directly to the scale of it when it's produced in a physical form. There are always material limitations and the technology to machine these miniatures. They probably found that with the Sisters of Silence, they couldn't get any really fine facial details, for instance, if they scaled them to be the height of a Space Marine's nipples. I get that. But as I say, that's a problem of their own creation. They could have just given all those Sisters of Silence helmeted faces, and it would have been fine. So that's a trade-off that could have been made. They chose not to, and that's fine. But I think the point we're getting at here is essentially that it's a much bigger issue to tackle a rescale of the Horus Heresy range. It is not a bad thing, and new miniatures will always be welcome, and I don't think people understand that point. Range updates good, but at this late stage in the game, it's not ideal, especially when you consider that many of the forces who are getting upgrade kits, say Sons of Horus, the Imperial Fists, they already have characters in that scale. I mean, bottom left, you can see an Imperial Fist Legion command squad. That command squad is shorter than the new guys that are coming out. Is it an issue? For me, it is an issue. It's not a huge issue, but it is an issue because it means that knowing the size of my destroyers are already on the shorter end of the spectrum as far as miniatures go, I know that if they release these new plastics, I will have a lot of trouble incorporating any power armor into my army because the height discrepancy will be quite noticeable. So my advice to people who are considering doing this would be to do something like basing your current miniatures with slightly taller bases to try and counteract that fact. If everyone's on tactical rocks, for instance, like I know most of my destroyer companies on tactical rocks because they're fighting on a mountainside. It actually made sense for them, and it's not just 1 foot up on the rock, it's usually the entire base is a rocky surface. Well, that might be the way you have to go in order to gain a mil or two of extra height and just try and make up that difference so that any new kits that come out, which are going to have different proportions, which is something we really haven't spoken about, but they'll have a much lankier, much more gangly proportions because the Space Marines in the new armor are much more slender man in body shape. People look at them and say, yes, this new Space Marine has much more human proportions. They forget the fact that the armor is inches and inches thick in this universe's background. Therefore, any human proportion should theoretically be lost because the thickness of the armor adds so much bulk to the individual. Everyone should look short and stocky. The one change they could have made to Space Marines that would have instantly fixed a lot of their scale issues would have been to simply downsize the heads of the Space Marines. Not the helmets, the bare heads, because the head is the thing that we measure the scale of the body of. And so the larger the head, the smaller the rest of the body seems in proportion. So by taking into account the fact that the armor is so thick and bulky, if they'd shrunk down the bare heads of Marines slightly, it would have actually made the physical body of the Marine seem a different size within that armor. But anyway, that's all from me for today. I hope this has clarified things for a few people because I know there's a lot of confusion about the raw points on display. And that's it. See you in the comments below. Back with the Outer Circle. Take care, and I'll see you all on the next one. Oh, and wait, one last thing before you go. This is a little something I've been working on, and you'll know what series it's for. Enjoy the spoiler.